Hi, I'm Sylvain. We thought it might be fun for people sitting at home to take a look at how we actually do a storyboard. We're assuming for this part of the event that we already know how to draw and that you're at the very least interested in imagery, composition, perhaps you have some initial knowledge of photography, design, things of that nature. And we're also assuming that a director at this point has given you a briefing on what he wants to see in 1 or 2 frames of storyboards. If this were a real meeting, what we might have is a director who in a meeting has told us that he might want to have Maximus on a horse in the center of the arena, kind of center frame, holding his sword to one side. With the royal box, for instance, in the back. And on a second frame, we might have a slightly wider shot of the hero on a horse. A typical storyboard can be done any number of ways. Certainly in the old days, the great masters of storyboarding, Mente Hübner, Sherman Labby, people like that, would be working primarily with charcoals on tracing paper. I think today people tend to work more with standardized pens that you might buy in any stationery store. I use standard pencils, HB and 2Bs. Usually HBs to do the lighter sketches and then 2Bs to do the deeper gouging into the paper. And then, as we'll see later, I use also a brush sometimes for the blacks. Otherwise, you can use any number of pens just to create a solid outline. If I end up using only very unsophisticated tools, then the temptation is to go too fast. And after a few years of that, you don't know how to draw anymore. So I force myself to stick to very traditional tools. And that's the danger of storyboarding, is that while you storyboard, you basically appeal to people who work in the film industry who are not, by and large, illustrators. They're people who are content with a level of drawing. So for them, they may compliment you and say, this is great work. And I think the predicament for an illustrator working in this business is to work fast without committing artistic suicide. I'm starting to lay down a sense of what my background is going to be, and I've decided that Maximus here is going to be in the arena, and we're going to get a hint of the royal box visible behind him, because in that royal box is Commodus and Lucilla. So in this particular shot, we want to indicate that they're in frame, in part because that means this shot will be obtained on a day where all these actors are present. What this also tells me is that this particular cropping is tight enough that we don't have to use any computer-generated images, because we're actually narrowing in on the part of Arthur's set which doesn't require any topping up of the image with CG, which would be this part right here and above. So we know as long as we're within a shot about this tight, this doesn't require any CG, which is actually the way we devised a lot of those scenes. With Ridley, we literally had a 3D model of the computer that we were looking at with a blocked out area in red. So now what I'm doing is inking the frames, and I do this. I do this so that the lines become a little bit more pure now and a little bit easier to read. And again, this could be done with any number of tools. You could do this with a pen, a little pentel with a thin nib. I just find that I get more personal enjoyment out of using a brush and a little bit more practice as well. And one of the reasons that I don't use a computer to do this, although I could and I have, is that you never know where you're going to be when you have to do a storyboard. And it's quite nice to have a computer around if you want to do colors or shading in Photoshop, for instance. It's very hard to do this sort of thing when you've become completely dependent on technology. I'm going to add a little bit of spit coming out of the horse for realism. And I think this is where storyboard can become an interesting craft, is when you try and take it to a level where it uses charm to communicate something. Now, one of the little tricks that we use in our business is to give a sense of foreground. We tend to make the lines thicker. And since that horse's head is in the foreground, I'm making it thicker now by outlining its outer layer. On this kind of lens, which is probably somewhere around a 35 or 38 millimeter lens, you can safely guess that you're not going to see a whole lot of detail in the background, because we have what's called a depth of field, which kind of lies a little bit about the distance of the objects and the focus of them. So on this kind of shot, you can safely assume that a lot of what's in the back is going to be slightly blurry. And this is how I'm going to indicate the crowd, because if I had to draw every character, I'd be there all day. I've actually done that on a couple of frames showing the arena, where literally it took like all day to do it. Okay, I'm going to use some Prismacolor markers to deal with light. Our primary light source is going to come from this direction, which is from the back of Maximus. Tends to be what Ridley does a lot of anyway, is shoot against the light. Basically, silhouettes diminish the amount of color, which actually helps a frame be prettier. But the minute that you assume that the light comes from the back, you can safely predict that what's in the foreground is going to be plunged in darkness, and this is where things become interesting. The minute shadows go down, your drawing takes on a sense of volume. Some people wonder sometimes how you know where to put shadows. And this is a mixture of guessing and experience. It's not important that shadows be 100% accurate. It's just important that they tell you information about the light and about where the light comes from. And one of the things that shadows do is they tend to leave a darker mark right at the edge where they split with the light. So that can create also a very pretty effect. Now what I'm doing back there is starting to hint at little shafts of light, because we know Ridley likes those little shafts of light. These are just little tricks that help the frame take on a greater depth, because the more you give light information in the background, the more you get a sense of the importance and the distance between things. For instance, the thinner those little streaks of light get, the further away we feel like they are. And what I'm doing finally now is adding contrast, just making sure that all the elements of this frame really pop. Okay, I'll do the second frame now. When we do storyboards, we sometimes get indications as to what source material we should be looking at. In the case of Gladiator, we had a certain amount of books which pretty much all featured the same material, because as far as archaeology is concerned, there's really not a whole lot of new information. It hasn't been in a long time. But when we talk about using reference, of course we use set sketches created by the production designer and his art directors, because those set sketches are more about the information pertaining to the layout of the scenes, where the set begins and where it ends. That's very important for storyboarding. But there's another level of reference that we can talk about, which is our personal artistic reference, and that has to do with how well do you draw a horse or a dog or a cow. How well do you draw it from the ceiling at a 45-degree angle? How well do you draw it running in any position? I had that problem with the rhinoceros, for instance. I don't think I ever had to draw a rhinoceros in my life until we got to Gladiator, because suddenly we had a scene with a rhinoceros. And the art department doesn't provide that. You're on your own. So I actually went to a toy store and bought a little plastic rhinoceros so I could have it on my desk and look at it. Some of the best illustrators I know use reference absolutely all the time. Working for different directors will often produce different results. In the case of Ridley, I've got my own sense of what his compositions are like. And most of all, when we work on a picture like Gladiator, Ridley does drawings. I've worked for other directors like David Fincher, who's also a very, very skilled artist. But I got less directions in a way from directors that are not as intent on drawing as Ridley is. By and large, I've concluded that really what he does is try to be as clear as possible about what he's saying. And I know for Ridley, sometimes it seems to be a game of telling the story with as little information as possible. In this instance, you're fairly tight on a horse. Is it necessary that every detail of the arm of the rider appears in frame? Well, obviously not. A composition might be much more interesting if you crop right here. It becomes more dynamic. When you're working for a composition, what you're really working for is an angle that can be quite minimal sometimes. Minimal in terms of the background, in terms of the light, in terms of what you're seeing. And part of what makes an image really beautiful sometimes is how little you show as opposed to how much you show. But I don't think that there's any more rules than that. I've certainly never heard Ridley talk about composition in terms of very strict rules. I don't think he sees it like that. The few times where I mentioned it, he just kind of laughs and says, well, you know, I've been doing it a long time. And I think he's extremely modest about it. I think he knows how good he is with composition. But I hardly know anyone who's as knowledgeable graphically, visually, as Ridley is. And he's passionate about architecture and photography. I'm doing the awnings over the arena, and you should really use all kinds of plastic tools to do this accurately. Now, these awnings were a subject of great debate. And the purpose of those awnings was to make sure that you could project shadows on the royal box at all times. Basically, the craftsman in Ridley was looking for interesting options to create an effect. In the end, most of the time you see those awnings, in fact, they're real. Okay, I'll just do some shadows and we'll be done. I think, again, the idea when I'm drawing like this is I'm trying to be happy with what I'm doing. I'm trying to leave a page and feel good about a day's work and say, you know, I'd put that drawing on my wall, or I'd give it to somebody I like. I mean, I think the nicest thing that's happened to storyboards is DVDs, because at least now people can see them. It used to be that nobody could see them. There we go. There you go. I hope this has been helpful. This is in no way pretending to be a course in how to storyboard, obviously. The techniques that I've shown here are just my own. They're a set of techniques that I've assembled over the years. This is just one of the many ways of doing it. The technique is less important than understanding the content of what a storyboard is. And long before you worry about camera placement, crossing the line, the most important thing you can do is actually concentrate on clarity. Nobody will ever blame you for doing a good drawing, and a clear one for that matter. Because on that level, the best thing you can do is make sure that all the crew members understand what the director spoke about and what he wants. That's the primary objective of a storyboard.